Hello and welcome to the fourth video of the Basics of Audio Technology training series. If you're just now joining for the first time, please stop and go watch the introductory video so that you understand what this video is all about and so that you can get a copy of the companion book that goes along with it. But without further ado, we're going to move on to Chapter 4, the basics of mixing. Now, when it comes to mixing, doesn't matter recorded or live scenario, the really only good way to learn how to mix is practice. You have to stand in front of a console or with the DAW software and practice, practice, practice. That is really the only good way to learn. So you might be wondering, how am I doing a video about that? Well, in this video, I'm not going to teach you how to mix. Instead, I'm going to go over the ideas, the principles, some things to think about, and then talk about every single tool that's commonly used for digital signal processing, like EQ and Reverb, go over the different parameters for each of them, and give you examples of those so that you have an idea of what they all do. So when you go in for the very first time to try mixing, you're not going in blind. You have an idea of what you're going for and what everything does, so that you have a good start. But before we get into those examples, I want to start with just the right mindset, because it doesn't matter how much knowledge you have or how good you are at mixing for a certain scenario. If you don't have your end product in mind, then you can completely screw it up. And so what do I mean by that? I'm talking about what is your purpose for mixing and who is your audience, because it's going to change. Just like there's no formula for miking up an acoustic guitar. You can't use the same microphone every time pointed in the same direction and it works all the time, because you're not taking into consideration the environment around you and the type of instrument, the type of player, what kind of music you're going for. That all gets considered when you're choosing a microphone and figuring out how to record that guitar. The same thing happens and is applied with mixing. You mix differently in different scenarios based on who your audience is and what the purpose is of that music and your purpose in that role. And so again, this video series is more geared towards churches. So I'm going to use church as an example. Different worship styles of Sunday services vary drastically. You'll have some bands with no electronic kind of sounding instruments. It's all acoustic. And then you have bands that are just have so many pre-programmed things, and they have laptops and a bunch of stuff. And then even within that, some people like it more quiet, some like it concert level, and everywhere in between. And so really you have to stop and think, who is my audience here and what is the purpose for mixing for this service? And once you can understand that, then you can start mixing in a way that's going to align with what the congregation or the audience is looking for. So for example, if you have somebody that is, just a complete, just amazing mixer when it comes to concert styles, because maybe they had a job or something like that, and now they're volunteering in a church where they like a quiet, more conservative worship style. If he mixes in the way that he did for concerts and tries to do it in that setting, it's not going to mesh well. Things aren't going to sound as clean. It's going to be too loud for a lot of people. There's going to be too much bass. It's not going to be the same thing. So you really have to keep your end audience and your product in mind when you're mixing. Everything beyond that is secondary. Everything that I'm going to go over today really is secondary to having that mindset. And specifically in a church, you want to have that servant mentality. You want to make sure that you're serving the people on the band, serving the people in the congregation. And mixing can be made hard for a lot of sound people, audio people, because of lack of education in the band, with teachers and preachers. And the best thing to do is just talk to them, go and equip them, go and teach them, help them understand so that they can help you. Otherwise, you're just going to be butting heads, and they're not going to understand why, you have to do this thing with this audio thing, and they're just going to want results. Just stop and talk with them and really have a servant mentality, and you're there to serve them. So again, everything that I'm going to talk about for the rest of this video is secondary to this first thing of just understanding what your purpose is, what your role is, wherever you are, and then who your audience is. And then you start mixing and tailoring for that. You kind of keep your own personal agenda out of it. And so the next thing I'm going to be talking about, and we're going to go on first, is setting proper line signal levels. So setting line signal levels. When I'm talking about setting line signal levels, I'm really just talking about setting proper input gain. And input gain, let's say, for example, you plug in a microphone, you have it going into a console. The input gain is the volume that you turn up for the very first input into the console. Without proper input gain, you're going to either have too much signal, meaning you're going to run into feedback and distortion problems, or you're going to have too little signal and you don't have enough signal to actually power the processors like EQ and stuff like that, or you're just going to introduce a lot of line level noise. So what I'm going to do is go to an example video now where I run through every single step of how to properly set input gain level and then talk about it a little bit. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up proper line level signals. Again, having a correct input gain is probably the most important thing versus any EQ effects or settings, because it's the baseline of everything that you're going to be working from. Too high of an input gain, you're going to run into problems with feedback, clipping, and distortion. And on the other end, you're just going to run into problems with not having enough input to run reverb or effects or anything like that properly. And you're also going to start to introduce the input noise or the line level noise of devices like this console or anything that you're using. And this is going to be a very simplified version on a very simple analog console, but it's the same concept throughout no matter what you're using. You want to do the same steps. So here I have a normal dynamic vocal microphone, Audix OM3. You're going to plug it in, and first thing you want to do is make sure that it's muted and make sure that everything is set to flat. You don't want to have any type of EQ, compression, noise gate, any effects. You don't want to have it running to any other sends or anything. You want to be working with it as it comes plain. So on this board, this is the input gain here. Have it muted, and we're going to hit solo. And that solo is going to mean that we're going to see the input come up on this meter. Now this board, as with other boards, has a setting for the solo to be after fader level, AFL, or PFL, pre-fader level. If you set it to after fader, it's only going to show up in the meter after you turn up the fader, which is not what we want right now. We want pre-fader level. So we're going to turn down the fader, and as soon as we start talking into it, we're going to see it start to come up. So check, 1, 2, check, 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 check. Hello, 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 check, check, check. And as you can see, we have input signal coming into the board. Now, you might be saying like, okay, well, I'm done. It's there. It looks like a good level right in the middle. We're done. But that's not the case. And that's usually what a lot of people run into trouble with. They ask somebody, hey, can you start checking the microphone, make sure I have a good level? And they'll like, check, 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 1, 2, 3, ABC. And you're good to go. But then as soon as they start performing, that's when we run into issues. So, that's just my normal talking voice. But if I switch to start singing, I'm going to turn away from this microphone. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Nice ABCs there. You can see I was almost clipping on the input. So when we're setting levels, you want to set it at performance level. So you want to ask whoever is playing their instrument, whoever is singing, to play at performance level. Say as loud as you would when you're performing. So I'm going to do this again, and I'm going to set my input gain based on performance level here. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. All right. So I've just performed or just checked at performance level, turned the input gain to where it needed to be, and this is what you're aiming for. It's going to look different on every board. Analog board goes above 0. Digital boards go to a max of 0. But the concept is the same. You're going to be looking for 12 to 18, 16 decibels of overhead. So what that means is wherever your running normal level is, and maybe a peak, I think I peaked at 4, you still want to have 12 decibels of room above that, and that's called headroom. The reason you want to do that is, say, that's at performance level, but sometimes in the middle of performance, a singer might get really into it, or they come up really, really close on the microphone, or, there's a lot of variables. You want to have some extra room for safety, just so that way, if they do make some loud noise or yell or do something, it's not going to overload your input. It's not going to cause distortion or clipping or anything like that. So we're looking for 12 to 16 decibels of headroom. So I set that, and that's pretty much it. You want to set everything flat, mute it, pre-fader level, have somebody perform at perform at their performance level, and make it so that it's averaging around 12 to 16 decibels below the max, leaving 12 to 16 decibels of headroom. And then as soon as you have that in, you just want to make sure that everything's working. So you can unmute the channel, turn up your mains, and I'm going to mute this one microphone and then unmute the other one. Check, 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 check. 1, 2, 3. Check, check, check. And so this is me talking into the vocal microphone. So if I start singing A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you can kind of hear that. I don't think I have the levels set quite well in the recording, but you get the idea. And so that is how you set proper line level input. Again, it's going to be different on different devices, consoles, whatever you're using, but the concept is the same. One more time, you have it muted, have everything flat, you have your meters soloed so you can see what's coming in, you ask somebody to perform, something to check at performance level, and you set the line level input gain up to leaving 12 to 16 decibels of headroom. And that is how you set proper line level input. So hopefully after watching that video, you have a very good understanding of how to set proper input gain and that you can go through that process on your own. Again, if you need to, just stop and go watch it again. And it'll take practice to get into the habit of doing everything correctly. But the number one thing to remember is just mute before you start and then set levels at performance level. So that way, when people actually start practicing, your levels aren't going to be too loud across the board. And again, remember, your number one most important thing when mixing is having the right mindset, understanding your role and purpose and what your end product or who your audience is. And then number two, setting proper input levels. If you have those two things in place, then the rest of mixing is going to be a lot smoother and easier for you, and you're going to run into a lot less problems. And so now I'm going to move into showing examples of different digital signal processings and just real examples of things we talked about in other chapters. Okay, so these first two examples that I'm going to be talking about are not about digital signal processing quite yet. It's just giving you real world examples of some things we already talked about in the past chapters, and they're all revolving around phase. So this first example is a recording I did with a friend. And we have a microphone on the top of a snare and a microphone on the bottom of a snare. And when somebody hits the snare drum, the head moves down away from the microphone on top. But when sound travels to the bottom, the head of the bottom one goes towards the microphone. So those two tracks are going to be phase inverted. And so as you can see here in Logic, where I recorded the two, if I zoom in all the way, you can see that the top snare mic goes down first and the bottom snare mic goes up first. And so what I'm going to do is just put this in a loop so we hit we hear the first three hits of the snare, and I'm going to go in between phase invert, which means they're not in phase, and then I'm going to phase invert the bottom one so that they're in phase, and just hear the difference. Now this isn't a very clear-cut difference. You're going to have to listen to it a few times, but you should be able to hear it if you turn it up considerably. Don't turn it up quite yet, just if you need to. So here we go. This is the snare with phase inversion turned on. Now, as you can see here, the two snare channels peaked at negative 0.9 decibels. Now when I turn the phase inversion off, play it again, it peaks at negative 2.2 decibels. So you have almost a 2 decibel difference in the amount of snare sound you get when it's not phase inverted to be in phase with each other. And depending on your recording or what scenario you're in, that could be a lot because you might really need some more of that snare drum punch. Now let's listen to it again. That was without the phase invert. Now it's in phase now. That's off. And then on. Off. On. So it's a very subtle change that you hear, but it's in the mid to low range of the snare. You get a lot more fat sounding lower end warmth of the snare when they're both phase inverted. And when they're not, it sounds a little more just like weak kind of sounding snare. So I'll do it one more time. This is phase inversion on, so it's in phase. Off. On. Off. Okay, and so that's just one example of using phase inversion to make sure that your signals are in phase with one another so that you don't have deconstructive interference. Again, this change was subtle. You only had about a 2 decibel or closer to 3 decibel decrease in sound, and then you lost a lot of the low end warmth to the snare. But within the entire mix of the song, it's not going to be very noticeable. Now, depending on what you're recording, that could be a huge difference. So it's very important to take into consideration phasing. And so the next one I'm going to talk about is time alignment. This next example is about time alignment, which goes back to phasing problems. So in this example, I recorded one acoustic guitar simultaneously using 2 different stereo recording techniques. The first was a spaced pair, and the second was a mid-sized pair. And originally, they weren't time aligned, so I had to time align them together. And so, as you can see here in Logic, I have the spaced pair up here, and then I have the mid-side pair here. And they are not time aligned. They're just slightly off from starting together. So I copied that and I pasted it, and we have 2 different versions. We have a time aligned version here at the beginning, and I'll zoom in on that so you can see the beginning of the recordings match up together. And then the non-time aligned version is back here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an A-B listen session. We're going to listen to time aligned and then not time aligned and just see if you can hear the difference. So here we go. Now not time aligned. Back to the time aligned. Not time aligned. So again, the change is subtle, but depending on your mixing scenario, it could be a huge change. So when we listen to the beginning, the first one where it's time aligned, you're going to hear a lot more lower frequencies, and it's going to have a nice warmth sound to it. Now listen again to the low end here. It's definitely not as warm of a sound, and that low end is gone. And I put the analyzer here so you can kind of see it, and I'll play it again and just pay attention to the analyzer. So seeing it is not as big, like it's really hard to see the difference, but you can really audibly hear the difference. A lot more low end presence on this one. And just overall a warmer sound. The second one lacks the low end. And then if you're paying attention to the high sounds, you can hear that slight delay. It sounds like it's in a slightly more, a room that's more lively and has a little more reverberation to it. especially kind of in the higher clicky kind of pick sounds. And so this is just an example of time alignment. You want to make sure that whatever track you're mixing, if it's a live setting, you want to have the delays set in prior to recording. Make sure that your distances are all measured, and just remember the rule of thumb, 1 millisecond per foot delay. And then if you record it, then you have the ability to go in like I did and physically move the tracks to time align them afterwards. But time alignment does affect phasing, as you can hear, and depending on what you're mixing for, it can be a huge difference of a sound, or it could be something that you just ignore, but it is something to take into consideration. And so the next thing I'm going to be talking about is EQ. All right, so EQ. EQ is just short for equalization, and it is probably without a doubt the most commonly used tool when mixing. It doesn't matter what device you have, if it has any sort of effect for mixing, it's most likely EQ. And again, EQ is just short for equalization. And it is a filter or series of filters that boost or attenuate a specific frequency or a range of frequencies. So that just means that it turns up or it turns down a frequency or a range of frequencies. Now, not all EQs are made equally. There's so many different types of EQs and just designs, and some have lots of buttons, some have few buttons, some have faders and sliders, and it doesn't really matter which one you're using. They all kind of use the same three different types of filters. That's the shelf filters, the cut filters, and then the peak and dip kind of parametric filters. And so I'm just going to go over those generally real quick here. So we're using the same song. I'm going to be using the same song for all of my examples. And we're back to the acoustic guitar. And here's probably one of the most common types of EQs you'll see in the digital age with a digital console or on a computer. And this has one of every type of filter that you'll most commonly see. So we have the low cut, and we have the low cut and the high cut filters that we're going to talk about first. And they do exactly what they say. They cut out low frequencies, or they cut out high frequencies. These are also referred to as high pass because it lets high frequencies pass through, or low pass because it lets low frequencies pass through. And so I'm just going to let you listen here to what they do. So this is the guitar with no EQ. And this is the guitar with the low cut kind of drastically turned on. So as you can hear, it took out a lot of those low frequencies, or like almost all of them, because we moved it all the way up here to about 110. So it just cuts out those frequencies. And then the opposite end, we're just going to take out the high frequencies. And so those are the two differences, high and low. And you really use high and low cut frequencies when you really just want to get out of the way all of these frequencies. It's not about turning them down slightly. It's just about getting them out of the picture altogether. And within a low and high cut filter, you do have some parameters. You can change the frequency that you want it to start, the frequency that you'd like for it to start, and then you can change the slope. And the slope is always done in decibels per octave. So remember, octaves are just mathematical integers of frequencies. So how many decibels would you like to go down per octave? And that changes the slope. So how quick and how steep do you want to make that? And then the Q similarly affects the slope along with that. And you have that on both high cut and low cut filters. Now the next that is similar, because it affects a whole range, but different, is the shelf filters. Now the shelf filters are designed not to get those low or high frequencies out of the picture altogether. It's just about turning them down just a little bit. And so here's the low shelf. And so I'm just going to turn down those low frequencies just a little bit. And so now you can hear the difference as I was turning it off and on. The low frequencies were louder and then just not as loud, but they weren't gone completely like the low cut filter. And I'll do the same here on the shelf. And for the shelf, let's say I just want to hear that bright shimmering guitar sound a little more. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go the opposite way. I'm going to turn it up some more. And so with that one, you hear a lot of the pick sound coming in as well. And so with a shelf filter, you do also have which frequency you would like for it to start at, and change over how loud. And then here, you can change kind of how quickly the slope goes with the Q setting. All right. And so the next one that we're going to be talking about is the peak and dip filter. And so that's these here in the middle. And they call them peaks and dips because when you turn them on and off, they create peaks and dips. And so peaks and dips are specifically for a range of frequencies that you want to kind of boost just a little bit or turn down just a little bit. You really don't want to use peak and dip filters to make huge changes. You want to make just kind of minor changes. If you're having to make huge changes, then maybe you need to change how you're recording it or the microphone that you're using. And so in this example, I'll just load up the EQ that I preferred for this guitar and just let you listen to the difference here with the peak and dip turned off, the parametric EQ. And so I decided to take out these frequencies here because when they were present, it kind of made a more open, kind of wah-y kind of sound. This was a stereo recording, and so I think there's probably some phasing issues within those frequencies. And so by just turning them down a little bit, I was able to make the guitar sound a little more clear and a little more defined. Now, when it comes to a peak and dip filter, you might be asking, well, how did you decide that's the frequency you want? How do I know what frequencies I want to turn up and which ones do I want to turn down? And that's where you can just practice with sweeping the filters. And that literally means you take the filter, and I always start by turning it down considerably with a medium kind of Q, and then I sweep the frequency spectrum. And I listen closely as I go back and forth, and I really pay attention to what sounds good and what doesn't sound good and where I'm at when that happens. And so before I do that and give you an example of it, I just want to show that these filters have the same parameters. The frequency that you'd like to change, the decibel range of either boosting or attenuating, and then the Q. And the Q is simply the width. And again, it's how many decibels per octave. And do you want it to be wide or do you want to be very narrow? And so here I'm going to go about a medium Q, go down a lot. I'm going to play this guitar, and then I'm going to sweep the filters and figure out what are the frequencies that I really don't like. And so here I land very similarly close to where I was originally. I think originally I was like 690. So somewhere in this broad range is the frequencies that I don't like. But when you take it down so much, it begins to sound unnatural. So I found the frequencies I don't like. Now I need to turn them up, turn them down to a level that it doesn't sound so unnatural. And just for listening purposes, so you can see these, I'm going to boost them so you really hear those frequencies that I was trying to get rid of. Yeah, those frequencies really did sound kind of like a wah sound, and I do believe that there were some phasing issues there. Now, the last thing when it comes to, well, actually, before I move on, I'm just going to show one more filter, and that's just the notch filter. And notch filters are built into different consoles in different ways, but really all a notch filter is, it's a dip filter with a set Q, a very, very narrow Q, and it only goes down. And the only parameter that you can change within it is simply just the frequency. And the notch filter really is only used for just feedback, or if there's a room node that's really boosting one specific frequency in a room, and it's just to get kind of one frequency out of the way. And so that's a notch filter. But now I'm going to move on and just talk about EQing in general and some things to keep in mind. The first thing is, like, you just don't want to EQ too much. You can get really carried away with just nitpicking just one single instrument. But you really have to keep in mind your entire mix. If you spend so much time on one instrument and you make it sound completely perfect, then you move on to the next, you move on to the next, and you do that with every single individual instrument. Eventually, when you turn everything back on, you hear the band as a whole, it might sound completely horrible. So when you're mixing, you really do want to mix the instrument into the entire band, not just making it sound good by itself. And that's why I use a lot of low cut filters for a lot of things, because I don't want to muddy up the bass where the bass guitar would be and have a lot of things just riding on top of that. I want to really clear it up. So I do tend to take out a lot of things where it wouldn't sound good by itself, but in the mix it sounds good with everything else with it. And then the next thing with mixing is you want to focus and practice more deconstructive EQing methods. And what I mean by that is, in this example, I really liked the guitar when it sounded like this. So that means I took out these frequencies and I took out these frequencies. So another way of saying that is I really just like these frequencies and I like these frequencies. So rather than taking out these in the middle here, right here, why don't I just boost the frequencies that I like? And so now you can listen to it. It is going to be a little louder. And so, yeah, it kind of gets the same feel across. It kind of sounds similar. Yes, it is a lot louder because you're boosting a lot of frequencies. And that's where the problem comes in. So you do make the guitar sound good, but it is a lot louder. And so if you start doing constructive EQing with every single instrument, before you know it, your entire mix is going to be very, very loud. And all of those frequencies that you didn't like are still going to be there. They're just going to be overpowered by everything else. And then you're going to start running into problems with feedback and distortion and just everything generally being too loud and out of control. So you really want to focus on what are the frequencies I don't like and just trying to get those out of the way. And so the last thing with EQ, like I said, is there's all different types of EQs. They come in different shapes and sizes and modes. And really the best thing to do is to read your manual and figure out which each one does. And so here, this one in the top right is a graphic EQ, and they call it graphic because when you move the sliders, it'll look like a graph. And so graphic EQs have fixed frequencies. You can't change the frequencies that they're going to be changing. This is a digital one, so I think on some digital ones you can, but for the most part, if it's an analog or if it's on a console, it's going to have a fixed frequency. It also has a fixed Q, so you don't really know how wide of a range of frequencies you're changing when you turn this up and down. So again, you have to read the manual and figure out what it is. Or if you don't have a manual or it doesn't say, you just have to play around with it and listen to it. So if I do that, let me turn, this is off. I'll turn this one on. And we'll just listen to it. And so for this graphic EQ, you would really have to play around with how does it affect those frequencies and those specific ranges. But graphic EQs really aren't meant for instruments. Graphic EQs are meant for more of monitors or systems and speakers and stuff like that, where it's kind of a permanent installation. You really don't want to use graphic EQs for instruments. It's more for installations and permanent things. What you might most commonly see on an analog board or a console is parametric EQs or fixed knob EQs, and they have different parameters. And so you might see little symbols that give you a hint of what they do, but again, until you read the manual, you won't know exactly. And so this just simply has a low cut set at a very specific Q, but you can change the frequency. Then it has a shelf, a low shelf. You can change the frequency and boost or attenuate, but you don't know what kind of slope that's at. Then you have one parametric EQ in the middle, and then at the top you have one high shelf. And so this is typically what's found on a console for an analog console. And again, you just have to read the manual to see what it does. And then sometimes you just have singular EQs. So this EQ here that I've loaded in, you can only use one of. You can't use all of these. You have to pick just one. And again, they're all the same thing. Low cut, shelves, parametric. These are your basic tools for EQ. Those filters: low cut, low shelf, parametric, high shelf, and high cut. Those are the 5 things that you will always see in an EQ, regardless of which one you're using. And so that wraps up EQ. And again, the most important thing is really focus on destructive EQing methods rather than destructive EQing methods, and then go back and just pay attention, read the manual, and understand what you're working with. But that's essentially it. You have those 5 different types of filters. You can change the frequencies, you can change the boost or attenuation decibels, and then you have the width or the Q or the slope that you're working with. And that's the basics of EQs. All right, so compressors. Compressors literally compress the dynamic range of the instrument or track that you're working with. And the dynamic range is simply the quietest of the quiet sound and the loudest of the loud sounds, and the range in between. And so it literally takes the loudest sound and compresses it down so that your range is not as much. And you might think, well, isn't that going to make everything quieter? Yes, it will. But compressors also have what's called a makeup gain, where you can shift that now compressed dynamic range and then move the whole thing to make it louder. It's just not as dynamically expressive, meaning the louds aren't as loud comparatively to the quiets. There's not as much range. And so there's 2 main purposes of why you would use compression. The first is to kind of wrangle in those loud sounds and put them in a place where it's easier to manage, so that you're not constantly having to put all your fingers on the faders and moving everything up and down, because as songs change, they get louder and quieter naturally. All the instruments are going to change, and some instruments and vocals and stuff get louder more than others very quickly, and you can't sit there and change all the faders all the time. So compression just allows it all to be put in kind of a happy medium, where you just know some things aren't going to get too loud on you too quickly. And the second thing is it can put things kind of at the forefront of the mix. And what I mean by that, let's use vocals for an example, is if you take the dynamic range and you squash it down, because vocals can be very, very quiet, and they could also get very, very loud quickly, especially if you're moving closer and farther away from the microphone. It just squashes that dynamic range, so the quiets aren't as quiet and the louds aren't as loud. And then when you make it up, it just kind of becomes loud all the time, meaning it's at the front of the mix. And vocals, sometimes you want to do that because the vocals might be the important part of the song, the most important part, because you want to listen to the words, you want to sing along to the words. Like, the vocals have a lot of importance. They carry the main melody, and so you want them to sit kind of loudly at the front of the mix. But it's very easy to overdo that in terms of just dynamically expressive in the song. Like, the quiet part of the song, the vocals are too loud. The loud part of the song, the vocals are just, there still. Like, it's just too loud all the time. And you can easily overcompress everything so that the dynamic range, the ebb and flow of your song, just that good feel, it's just kind of gone because everything is just kind of loud the entire time. So you do have to be careful about using compression. But again, the two main things are just to kind of wrangle in those loud sounds or to put something kind of at the forefront of the mix. And so we're going to move over here to Logic, and I'm going to be using a bass guitar as an example. And we're just going to just go over the different parameters of a compressor. And so first, I'm just going to play it with no compression. And so as you saw over here, the bass kind of peaked around -5 decibels, and when he wasn't playing, -10 decibels. And that's the first and foremost thing that you have to pay attention to with compression is your input gain. Understanding where the instrument or the track you're working on, what's the dynamic range of it, because the next thing is the first step is setting your threshold. If you don't have an understanding of how loud something is in the meter, then you can't accurately set your threshold. And so what the threshold does, it sets the point at which the compressor starts to engage. So if I put the threshold all the way up here at -4, where the bass wasn't reaching, and I hit play, the compressor does not engage. And so if I come down here, put it down more, and I'll go to the meter, you can see the compressor start to engage. And so threshold is the first thing. It's the point at which your compressor starts to engage. The next step is your ratio. And the way the ratio works is, I'll set it for 2:1 right now. So for every 2 decibels increase in volume, the compressor will only allow 1 decibel increase. If I move the ratio back up even higher to 8:1, for every 8 decibels increase in volume, the compressor will only allow 1 decibel increase. And so what I have here is an extreme compression. Like, this is a lot of compression. And so I'll just let you hear it. And as you can hear, the whole loud part of the bass just got squashed and the entire bass just became quiet. And so that leads into our next thing, which is the makeup gain. And so we can just move that up, let's say 6 decibels or 8. Let's go up even more. Let's go to 10. And so you can hear the difference. The dynamic range is not as expressive. When he stopped playing the notes and you heard the strings, you heard the quiet sounds, they were louder because the dynamic range was squashed. Everything was kind of sitting there together within the instrument of the bass guitar. And so this is a prime example of over compression. There's just no expressivity to the bass. If he was trying to play on a quiet part of the song, it would still just be too loud. And then when he tried to play on a loud part of a song, it would just be too quiet. The bass is just kind of there and it doesn't sound great. It just doesn't sound natural. So this is over compression. But I'm just showing you this just to be an example of how it actually works. So again, threshold, the point at which it engages, your ratio, how much output do you want for the incoming volume change, and then your makeup gain so you can shift the entire dynamic range. Now the next few things are a little more tricky to work with. The knee just simply takes the point at which it engages here in this little corner and softens it up. So it makes it a nice curve as opposed to a point. The next is the attack, and that's how quickly the compressor engages after it reaches that threshold over here. And so if you put the attack too quickly, you're going to squash kind of too much of that dynamic range, especially if you're putting compression on, let's say, a kick drum, where it's a very fast sounding thing. If you put too fast of a compressor, you don't get that like initial thud and thump of the kick drum, and it just kind of squashes that. So then your kick drum can just sound a little kind of thin and weak. So you want to increase your attack just a little bit to allow just some of that kind of initial thud, make it sound more natural, and then it starts to decrease it and squash that dynamic range. Alternatively, on the other side, if you have too much of an attack, it's going to engage too late. So again, for a kick drum, it's a very quick impulse. You hit it and then it's gone. If you have a 200 millisecond delay for your attack, it's going to hit it. You're going to have all the full dynamic range of that kick, and then it's going to compress after the fact, and it's not going to help anything. And then the next thing you have is your release, and that's how quickly the compressor disengages after it's been engaged. And so for this compressor specifically, it's how quickly does it disengage after it reaches the point of the threshold going back down again. Sometimes compressors, the release is how quickly it releases after the initial attack. So you just have to work and play around with the compressor that you have, just like you have to play around and learn any other thing that you're using with mixing. And so these are all the 6 basic parameters of a compressor, and that's really all you have to know, is that's how it works. Then we have some added functions that you might see on other ones. So this one has a mix, where you can mix how much compression is going back into the original mix. If it's a compressor that's built into a console or something like that, the mix is almost always 100%. Then you have an output gain, which can be additional to your makeup gain, but it's very similar in a makeup gain. And then you have distortion, where your compressor can add in types of distortion to kind of give it a crunch to it. And then here we have a limiter. And so a limiter is the next thing that we're going to talk about. And all a limiter is just a very harsh compressor. It just limits the output so that you don't go over your peaks, so you don't have pops and clicks and distortions. And if I were to make a graph of a limiter, it would look something like this, but actually almost completely flat. It would let no more dynamic range come out after the increase of the threshold that you sent. And so this one has a built-in limiter, but sometimes limiters are just their own thing. But really, just think of a limiter as a very harsh, flat compressor. And so this is how a compressor works, and these are all the different parameters. And so now I'm going to show you a compressor in action. And it's actually going to be a slight variation of compressor. It's going to be a multipressor. And so a multipressor is just a series of compressors combined together. So this is a 4-band multipressor, which means you have 4 different compressors, and each compressor works with a specific frequency range. Now we're listening to a bass guitar, and I wanted to use a multipressor because the lowest frequencies of this bass guitar were just too boomy and just out of control. They got too loud and kind of just washed out and just didn't sound great. I don't know how else to best explain that. And then the higher frequencies, I just didn't want some of those like string slaps and string sounds to get out of hand, so I just put a little less compression on that, and I didn't put as much makeup gain on it. So now when we go back and we listen to it, this is going to be the bass guitar with no compression whatsoever. Now this is with the multipressor. Off again. On again. And so there's a subtle difference there, but you can hear the lowest end of that bass does get kind of like out of control, just too boomy. And so now I'm going to play it with the entire track of the song so you can hear how it fits in the mix. So this is with the multipressor. And this is with it off. And so I would say that you could really hear the most difference in the multipressor being on and off when it comes to this note here, the da dum 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 dum. That third one, that third hit right around here. Let me get my cursor right around here. If you watch as it's playing, this is where you're going to hear the most difference between multipressor off and on. So I'm going to play it again with it on. That was on. Now listen to it off and pay attention to this one section. And so you could really hear how just right there it got very boomy and just kind of out of control. And so that's why I used the multipressor. It just kind of wrangled it in. It kept the bass nice and tight and just kind of fit in the pocket without getting that over boominess to it. And so that's a prime example of how you could use compression on bass. And really you could use compression on just about every single instrument to really help you kind of keep everything in control. But just be careful. It is very easy to overdo compression and everything. And so that ends our section on compression. The next thing we're going to move on to is expanders. Okay, so expanders are a tool that you're probably not going to use nearly as much as you will the other two. It's only used for very specific purposes, and the easiest way to think of an expander is it is the exact opposite of a compressor, but it uses the exact same parameters and works the exact same way, just in reverse. So what it does is it squashes the dynamic range and it brings the quietest things and makes the quietest things louder, as opposed to compression, which takes the loudest things and makes the loudest things quieter. So an expander really is just the complete opposite of a compressor. So if we move over here to Logic, we're going to be using the acoustic guitar again here. And as you can see, you have your input, so you can see what's happening. You have your threshold, where the expander starts. Your ratio, again, but it's the opposite. So for every half of a decibel increase that's going up, it's going to double that to one increase, or one full decibel increase. Then you have your gain makeup, your knee, your attack, and your release. So it really is the exact same parameters as compression, just used in the opposite way. And so again, this is not going to be used nearly as much. This is going to be for very kind of expressive, very quiet instruments that it might be hard to record, or in a very expressive kind of musical format, such as orchestras or something, in a section of the song where they got very, very quiet, because orchestras have a huge dynamic range. And if you're only recording with one or two microphones for the entire thing, there might be a point at which you need to use an expander at the quietest part of the song. I do not actually use an expander anywhere on this song, on this album, on this track, but I simply just place one here on the acoustic guitar just to give you an example of how it sounds, and so an example of where you might want to use it. And so I'll just play this guitar without the expander. And so it is quiet, and yes, it will just make it overall louder. And so I could just, turn up the whole fader to make it louder, but I may not want everything, kind of brought that loud. And so specifically, I just kind of want the higher sounds to come through, like kind of that shimmery pick sound. And so we'll turn this on and see what happens. So let's turn it off. Then on. So yes, it did increase the overall volume, but it did it a little differently than just turning up the fader. Because if I just turn up the fader here, we turn the reed off. I can only max out at what my fader allows me to. I can't go beyond that. The expander can help me go beyond that limit. So let's turn the expander back on and take a listen. So it is much louder than what I could have done by simply just turning it up, because my fader was my limit. So the expander allowed me to go beyond that limit. But at the same time, if you listen carefully, you can hear kind of the quietest parts of that guitar are made louder, and the dynamic range is squashed a little bit, just like it was squashed with the compressor. And so really, that's expansion. You're not going to be using it much at all. Again, there's very few instances we use it, but just remember, it's compressor in reverse, and all the parameters are the same. And so the next thing we're going to be moving on to is digital noise gate. Okay, so noise gates, I think the easiest way to think about a noise gate is think about a physical gate, something that opens to allow something to go through. And so just like a compressor, noise gates have a threshold limit. So we're going to turn here again to Logic. I'm going to be using a snare drum as an example here. And so as I press play, you can see here it shifts from open to close, open to close. And just like compression, you have a threshold at which it engages. So you have a point at which that gate is going to open, and that gate, when it opens, it's going to allow sound to go through. So here I'm going to play it again. That's with the noise gate turned on. This is with the noise gate turned off. You hear the hi-hat and the cymbals and everything within that track of audio coming through heavily. Now let's turn it back on and listen again. You still hear them, but they are greatly diminished because we have a reduction parameter here. And so we've reduced it by 25 decibels. That means when the gate is closed, the volume is reduced by 25 decibels. So let's make it to the extreme here and put it down all the way to 100 decibels and listen. Okay, and so as you can tell, it starts to sound a little unnatural, and that's because instruments have a natural decay, as we've talked about, the envelope, the sound envelope. They have a natural decay, and if your attack, hold, and release, if those are set off, it's not going to sound natural. Specifically here, my hold and release. If my hold is too short and my release is too short, let's do that, it's going to cut off before it starts to sound good. Yeah, it just cuts off too soon. You don't actually get the full snare sound. So let's increase it again, back to kind of where it was. And so it starts to sound natural. And so again, you have threshold, reduction, the attack, the same as compression. How quickly does it engage? For noise gates, you do want to have a fairly low attack, depending on what you're using, but for the most part, it's always low. And then your hold and release change greatly on what instrument you're applying the noise gate to. If it's a quick instrument like a snare where it comes and goes, then you want a short release and a short hold. But let's say it's like a timpani or an orchestral huge like bass drum or something. If you ever needed to put a noise gate on that, you want a long release and a long hold because it does naturally have a very long decay. And so you really, when you're using noise gate, you want to make it sound as natural as possible. The last thing here is the hysteresis. And that's the point at which the noise gate begins to close again. So if I put it at 0, that means when it hits a threshold of 26 decibels that I have set here, the noise gate's going to open. And then as it hits going down in decibels, negative 26 again, it's going to start the closing process of that release. Now, if I turn the hysteresis down to 6, or let's make it an easy number, to 4, that means it's not going to shut off until it gets down to negative 30 decibels. And so that helps you with making it sound a little more natural. And so this noise gate specifically comes with extra features where you can have more specific frequency-specific noise gates. And I set them to kind of take out the very lowest of the lows for the kick and the highs, just those cutoffs. So it only lets in the frequencies in between those. And those are the frequencies that the snare drum really shines. And so again, let's listen with it turned on and turned off. And drums are a very, very real example of where you would use noise gates almost all the time. And that's because we have one single instrument, and you typically have multiple microphones over different portions of the instrument, and you don't want to have that bleed. You don't want the hi-hat in every single microphone for your kit, because then all of a sudden your hi-hat's going to be uncontrollable. You can't really make it quieter because it's coming in everywhere. And so noise gates are the best way to reduce that problem. And again, noise gates have all the same parameters as compressors and expanders do. They just work a little differently. And so that is a noise gate. Okay, so the next and last tool for mixing that I'm going to talk about is reverb. And reverb is short for reverberation. And all reverb is, it's an effect that tries to mimic the recreation of natural reverberation in a room. So you can record a microphone 1 inch away from a person's mouth, and then with reverb you can make it sound as if it's in a cathedral or in a in a stage or something like that, all by mimicking the natural reflections of a space. And you have to understand the sound envelope, and we've talked about this in previous chapters. And so I'm going to turn here to Logic and just show you one type of reverb. They're all different types of reverb. Again, just like everything else, you have to know what you're working with, read the manual, understand it, play with it. They're all different, but they all have the same parameters. They just look different. And so again, reverb is trying to emulate or mimic the natural sound of something around us. And so when we think about the sound envelope, again, we have attack, decay, sustain, and release. And so this basically mimics that. We have our pre-delay. So that's mimicking our early reflections. We have our attack, our decay, our sustain, our release, and then we also have a hold as well. And so here on this one, we actually have a dry signal delay, which would delay the entirety of the sound, so to offset it, so we can have like type of echoes as well with this one. Most reverbs don't have a dry signal delay, but they do have a pre-delay, and so that is going to mimic the early reflections. So if I wanted to mimic the reverberation of this room that you're hearing naturally now, I would think that I have a desk with hard surfaces, I have screens with hard surfaces, I have a wall here with a hard surface, and then a green screen behind me kind of blocking things. So it really just is a lot of early reflections and very short early reflections. So my pre-delay would be a very short pre-delay in this instance if I wanted to recreate this room. Now, if I'm in a gymnasium or gym where you play basketball or something, you're standing in the middle, your very first early reflections are still going to be fairly long because you're in a large space. And so that's going to be more of like 35 to 40 millisecond long early reflections. But if you're in, say, a large concert hall, your initial pre-delays are even going to be longer than that. And so that's what pre-delay mimics. It's the early reflections, the very first reflections that come back to your ears. The attack is how quickly does the energy reach its peak. And so you have to think about the space that you're in. If you're in a short, confined space, that attack is going to be short because you're going to have the loudest part come at you quickly because you're in a small space. Everything's going to reflect and come back to you. It's going to have a short attack. Now, if you're in a larger, bigger space, you're going to have a larger attack. Same thing with decay. Shorter space, less decay, larger space, more decay. Now sustain is specifically when you're thinking about an instrument in the sound envelope and you're projecting, so you're making sound. We're thinking opposite now. Think of sustain as continuing the energy. So again, like we talked about, if I have a violin and I have a bow, I'm continuing to put energy into the system, so I have a long sustain. Whereas opposed to a snare drum, you hit it, your sustain is very short. You're no longer introducing energy beyond that initial attack. And so if you're mimicking something like that, you would have no sustain. It would all be just decay and release. And so that's a sustain. Then you have your release. Once you finish entering energy into the system, how quickly does it decay back to nothing? And then your hold also is part of the sustain. Sustain does more of the volume, and your hold is how long will the energy kind of stay at its medium and then decay. And so with all of these, this is the basics for a reverb setting. You're thinking about the sound envelope, you're thinking about the world around you, and you're trying to emulate that with this. And now there's some additional things that you can add with more higher end reverbs, but a lot of reverbs don't have these things that I'm going to talk about next. The next is density, and that's physically thinking about the amount of sound waves that you're spreading forth and how dense of all those reverbs and how much are coming back to your ears. And so we can have a high density where you have just lots and lots of reverb coming back at you, or low density where a lot of those reverberations, the energy just dies off until you don't have as much reverberation sounds coming back to your ears. And then the spread is kind of a way to think about how wide of a room do you have, and it also helps in terms of the size of the room, how much of a spread, and that's more specifically left to right spread to give you a stereo image. And so that if you're thinking of a concert halls are typically not very far left and right, but they go very far back. If you're trying to mimic a space that's more wide than it is deep, then your spread would want to be higher. And then high cut and low level frequency and crossover, those are talking about frequencies, but they will also help mimic spaces as well. Because remember that lower frequencies, the energy travels farther and it takes more time for it to decay to nothing, for the friction to stop that, because there's more energy in lower frequencies, and higher frequencies tend to decay quicker. So if you're trying to mimic a very large space, you would want to have a high cut that's fairly low because naturally the high frequencies will cut off quicker. And then you want lower frequency to be a little more boosted because those lower frequencies will linger more. But if you're in a smaller space, you want to have that high cut not as low because you will have a lot more higher frequencies coming back at you in a smaller space. And those low frequencies, that you want to tailor to what you think that room would sound like. If you had a lot of boost in your low frequency and a very high cut on your highs, then that would kind of equate to a very lively large room. You would have a room with a lot of reflective surfaces that is also large. And then your crossover is simply the crossover between where you want your high and your low frequency to be. Last thing for reverberation is your dry and wet sound. Your dry sound is your direct sound, it is coming straight from your mouth to the microphone. That's what that's emulating, your dry sound. Wet sound is everything beyond that. It's the early reflections and beyond. And so you can mix how much of a dry sound do you want, how close are you to the sound source, and then how much wet kind of reflections do you want. This can also go hand in hand a little bit with density. And so you have to think about this in terms of if you're recreating a space, you recorded, let's say, a vocal 1 inch away from the microphone, but you don't want to sound it so close, you can reduce the amount of dry sound, increase the amount of wet sound, so it kind of puts it back farther. And so with reverberation, you really just are trying to mimic a real world sound through an effect. And so I'm going to pause here and get ready, and we're going to go on to some examples of reverberation. Okay, so before I move on into this example, I just want to show you just really quickly some different types of reverb that you might see out there. This one's a very simple reverb. It's actually the one I'm using in this first example. Just a pre-delay, the amount of reflectivity, a different room size, the amount of density, and your mix. It's that simple. And then we have over here something a little more complex. These are about the same. This one just has a little more frequency control. You can change the shape of the room, how many reflective surfaces you have, your stereo base, and so this is how wide of an image it has, this specifically for your early reflections, then also your room size. Then you also, remember, we hear stereo, binaural hearing, so you can have more early reflections and reverb on one side as opposed to another to give you kind of the feel of you're standing close to a wall or something like that, and just really change the shape of the room. Again, you have your dry and wet mixer. And then your overall reverb, your crossover frequency, your spread, your initial delay, and then again your frequency responses. And so again, just like everything we talked about, it comes to understanding and knowing what you're working with, really reading those manuals and figuring it out. And so this example, I'm going to use this reverb. It's really simple because I didn't need a complex reverb and I like the way it sounded. So I'm just recording a Stratocaster guitar clean through an amp, and the amp has a little bit of spring reverb to it. And so we'll listen to it without my reverb on. Here we go. And so you can hear a little bit of the room that it's in and a little bit of that spring reverb, but I think it was almost non-existent. I don't really remember, but it just wasn't as lively as I wanted it to, and I needed to sit back farther in the mix because this guitar and the rest of the mix is pretty far back and barely audible. It's kind of like this shimmering thing in the back. So I just needed to add a little bit of reverb. So let's just do it again. Now with the reverb. Off, and then back on. So you could also hear how this reverb also changed the tone a little. It kind of upped up the lows, which gave the just imagery of a larger room, but there's still some shimmering highs, so it was pretty good, and that's because the reflectivity was down, but the room size is kind of medium, I guess, for this one, and it really isn't mixed that much. It's just a touch of reverb. So let's listen one more time with it on. Now with it off. It really does just kind of put it a little farther back like it's in a larger room. So now I'm going to play it with the entire mix so you can get a feel for what I was going for. So you can hear it in the back of the mix. It's kind of back, it's shimmery, and I wanted that room liveliness, and I really wanted the acoustic to shine at the front, and the acoustic was up front. And so that's one example. Now I'm going to move on to the next one, where we're going to listen to that slide guitar at the beginning. Now for this one, I used a very different type of reverb. This one's a space designer, and so it's meant specifically to try and emulate a specific space. And so I just used one of the presets and kind of changed it a little bit to what I want to go to, and this is what I came up with. And so let's listen to it dry again. So you can hear he already has some reverb on his guitar, and he's got some delay. You can hear kind of like an echo in there, but it is really kind of close to your face. And just like the other guitar, I mic'd this guitar 3 different ways. I had a close mic, 1 inch, and then I had one about a foot away, and then another one about 6 feet away. And I ended up going with the one about 6 feet away because I really wanted the biggest sound possible, but the room I was in wasn't very reflective. And so I had to add reverb. So let's listen to it again without the reverb. Now we're going to add the reverb in. Now it really does sound like it's in a hall, like like it says ambient hall, like it is in a much larger space. It is farther back in the mix, and that's what I was really going for. So now let's listen to it again with everything. Let's first listen to it without that reverb. It just doesn't have the same effect. So now let's turn the reverb on and listen to it. So now you can really hear the difference of what that reverb did. It made it sound farther in the mix, a much larger room, but then musically it also had that kind of ethereal, kind of spacey kind of sound, which is what we were going for. And so using the same exact guitar, we're going to move forward to a different part of the song. And we're going to listen here and just hear the difference of how much reverb can really add to your sound. So I'm going to do the entire mix. And we're going to do this without the reverb. So we're going to do it reverb turned off first. And this is a very big build part of the song. It's the biggest part of the song. And it just doesn't have the same effect without that reverb. So let's listen. And so that was supposed to be like this epic kind of out of nowhere, just guitar hit that's supposed to be huge and kind of like, you know, kind of concert, it's like in a large space, but it just kind of like it was lacking a little bit. So we turned up the reverb for this part, and here we go. Much bigger difference. Let's give it a little more of an intro so you can get a better feel for what's going on. So again, I'm going to play this part with no reverb. And so there's just this big decay to like this huge just kind of intro that goes to the very loudest part, but that little riff was just kind of weak. And so the largeness of the sound of the room that the guitar is in is really going to add to the song creatively. So let's add the reverb back in and listen one more time. And so that's it. Those are the 2 examples of reverb that I have. Very different examples. One, I just wanted to add just a little bit to make it sound in a room a little farther back in the mix. And then the other one did it so that it had this huge kind of impact, and it made you feel like you were in the space, and it just added creatively to the song, especially in that one part. It just added so much to that big impact, and without it, it just kind of sounded dead. And so some things to think about when you're using reverb is really the most important thing is trying to go for the space that you're trying to recreate. You should never blatantly just kind of or flippantly just put reverb because you're like, oh, you need more reverb. No, like the reverb, really you need to be emulating something and trying to achieve a very specific sound. Otherwise, you're just going to be spending so much time flipping knobs, changing things, and really not going anywhere. So have some space in mind for like a sound of space that you're going for, and then try to emulate that based on how you know sound operates in the world around us. The other thing to keep in mind for reverb is it's not something that you should use in monitor situations all the time. When it comes to in-ear monitors, reverb is very good, especially in a band when you're working with vocals. If you're singing and you're singing just a couple inches from the mic, and all the other instruments have these nice effects and they sound like they're in a room and stuff like that, but your vocals are coming in super dry, it's just going to sound a little off and a little weird, especially coming straight into your ears. And so adding a little bit of reverb to make your voice blend so you can hear what it sounds like with the whole entire band can be a good thing. However, when you're using monitors on floor wedges and you're not using in-ear monitors, reverb can be a very bad thing, because typically in a setting when you're using floor wedges, it means other people are using it, which means you have a lot of stage noise and a lot of stage sound. And so your problem there is you can't clearly hear yourself. And when you think about reverb, you're emulating a space and you're growing that space. And so if you add more reverb to the monitor mix, not only are you having the sound coming out and interacting with the world around you, now you're having this fake reproduced room sound coming out of the speaker and then also working with the room around you. So you're doubling the reverberation sound and you're having a more muddy, less clear sound of yourself. So when it comes to floor wedge monitors, really you shouldn't be using reverb at all because it's going to make it muddier and you're not going to be able to hear yourself as well. But when it comes to in-ears, you definitely want to use a little bit of reverb. But again, with the same thing with floor wedges, you use too much, your voice gets lost in the space of that reverberation. Because again, you're recreating a space and you're going farther back into the mix and you're not at the forefront of the mix. And when you're trying to hear yourself, you want to be at the forefront. And so those are kind of the last things to consider when using reverb. And just like with compression and everything else, it can very easily get out of hand. And so, again, have something in mind, go for a specific goal and purpose, and don't add too much reverb to everything. And that's it for reverb. Okay, so to wrap up the chapter, I'm going to be talking about some considerations for mixing. The first and foremost we've talked about at the beginning is remember your role and purpose as an audio engineer, specifically for the setting that you're in, and keep in mind what your end product is supposed to be or who your audience is. Remember to keep your personal agenda out of it. If you love super loud concerts, but you're not in a place that would be appreciative of that, don't mix that way. Secondly, remember to set proper line level signals. Without proper signals, you're not going to have enough for these processors to process these effects, especially when it comes to process intensive things like reverb. You have to have enough signal in there for the reverb to work accurately. And then also too much signal, and you're going to run into another host of problems. Now, the third thing is to remember to get out and practice. Get behind a console, get to a computer, and put your hours in. This video is not going to teach you how to mix. You can watch a ton of different videos that show you and teach you how to mix, but you're not going to learn until you physically do it yourself in the space that you're trying to do it in. Being in the space that you're going to perform in is huge and vital for learning how to mix. And secondly to that, like we talked about multiple times through the series, and especially in this chapter, each device is different. Not all of them are the same, so you have to learn how your device functions. You have to read the manual. If you don't have a manual, look it up online. If there's no information online, then spend time working with that specific compressor to see how it functions. Spend time figuring out what that knob does or what that fader does, and listen and go back and forth between on and off and really try and figure out how it works. Now, the next thing is something we talked about when we talked about EQ, but it applies really to everything else, and that's not spending too much time on one instrument. When I talked about EQ, it was about EQing one instrument and then moving on to the next and the next. And when you EQ them all to sound perfectly good by themselves, when you turn them all up together, a lot of frequencies are going to be overlapping, and it's probably just going to be a huge muddy mess. And we call this mixing for a reason, because you're trying to blend and mix all of these sound sources together to make a balanced final product. And so you can't spend too much time on one single thing. The only time you should spend time on one thing specifically if it's a huge problem, like you're constantly getting feedback or there's like a room node or something like that. You have to fix that to move on. But beyond that, don't spend too much time on one individual thing. And one thing I like to do when mixing is go to the middle of the room, especially in a live scenario, go to the middle of the room when they're having practice. sit in a hot spot, and then close my eyes. And I systematically go through every position in the band and I think, can I hear it? If I can't hear it, I open my eyes. Are they playing? And if they are playing, then that's a problem. I need to go and turn them up. And then I keep going through. If I can hear everybody, great. And then I switch gears a little bit. And I think, what do I hear too much? What is sticking out, kind of like a sore thumb? You want to have a well-balanced mix. So that means you hear everything all at the same time, but then you shouldn't be hearing too many things louder than other things because you want to have a balanced mix. Obviously, in worship, when vocals are really important because the words are what we're singing about, and we want to follow along and we're leading a congregation to sing the same thing and it's a sing along, you might want the vocals to stick out just a little bit more, but still, you don't want them to stick out like a sore thumb. Everything needs to be in balance. And so I just close my eyes and I start to think with my ears, and I don't rely on my eyes so much. And this is especially important when we're working with digital processors, which have screens and graphs and real-time analyzers, and you can see what you're doing with the EQ. Don't rely on your eyes so much. Close your eyes and listen with your ears. Like really, really, really listen and get your ears used to it, because you can get to the point where you hear something and you can say, oh, that's about the 1,000 kilohertz or the 1,000 hertz mark. And you'll be surprised that you can get to that point of calling out a range of frequencies and then being able to go and turn them down or turn them up. But the only way you can do that is practice, practice, practice. And so the next thing is to start thinking three-dimensionally as well. So we're talking about a balance. We're just talking about volume so far. And then you can take that and go farther with a stereo image, left and right. Make sure you don't have things too far left or too many things on the left or too many things on the right or too far spread out to kind of is getting lost in the mix. Have a good, nice stereo image balance, but then think three-dimensional when it comes to reverberation. You are recreating the space of a sound emanating in a space. And so if you have too much of that, more reverb is going to put it farther back in the mix. It's going to sound farther away. And so you have to think three-dimensionally. Some things you want a little closer and some things you want a little farther. So what do you want closer and what do you want farther? Again, with worship music, vocals are key. The words and lyrics are important. So you kind of want the vocals at the forefront. But remember, getting reverb and using reverb can be problematic very quickly. You're recreating a space. So if you're mixing, let's say, again, a mobile church in a gymnasium, and you're adding reverb and it sounds amazing in your headphones, well, that's not the space you're in. You're in a very reflective space with no acoustic treatment. So you put a lot of reverb into the speakers, a lot of reverb comes out of those speakers, and then has more reverb added to it because of the physical space of the room. And so all of a sudden there's too much reverb and it's just a hot, muddy mess. So in scenarios like that, I tend to use very little reverb, if any at all. And then the opposite is true. If you're in a very well acoustically treated room with carpeted floors and cushioned seats and lots of bodies and sound absorbers, then you need to add a lot of reverb to make it sound more natural and it's not as dry. It doesn't sound like the singer's coming through the speaker and they're just a couple inches from your face. It sounds like they're coming from a natural space. So use reverb and think three-dimensionally. You want to have a nice balance of volume, a nice balance left to right, and then a nice balance from forward to back and creating a sense of space. I like to think of it as kind of like a bubble or like a hemisphere, just having a perfect bubble of sound that it goes in all directions and everything is just perfectly neatly packaged in a nice balance package. And then I like to think of it as like a landscape, like what kind of room am I recreating with this mix and how does that sound? So just really picture the sonic landscape. And then finally, the last thing, we've talked about it before in other chapters, is thinking and listening critically and listening analytically. Again, critically thinking is about the characteristics of the sound itself. So you know the sound of the guitar that you're recording, and so you're thinking, am I reproducing that well enough? Does it have enough highs? Does it have enough low end? Or is the low end too boomy? Or is the high end kind of gone? Or is it too crisp and too many sounds and pops and clicks from the pick? You have to think critically when it comes to that. But then at the same time, you're creating music with a band, like you're helping the band create music. So you have to think analytically. And sometimes you have to sacrifice some of that critical listening and go more analytically. So in the case of the reverb example that I showed you with that slide electric guitar, right before that big build, that reverb that I use for that slide, I probably would never use in any other scenario in a normal like band setting. That is just way too much reverb for one simple little slide guitar. It's too just huge, but that's the sound that we were going for musically. We wanted a huge sound, and so one way you can think of it is just like, oh, you want a bigger sound, just crank up the volume. But if you crank up the volume, it messed with the balance of the song. So the other thing we could do was just make it sound as if it was in a large, huge space to help it give that huge feel to that moment in the song. And so we had to sacrifice that critical listening of that's just a big, like muddy, big sounding room. Why would you ever want that? We had to put that aside because it sounded better when we thought about it analytically and coming from the point of making music. So remember to listen critically and analytically and have a good balance of the both, but then you can sacrifice just a little bit. And so those are all my considerations when it comes to mixing. But again, the biggest thing is just go practice, practice, practice. You can watch these videos all day long. You can learn and subscribe to other things and like listen to other people, but you really won't become good at mixing until you go and practice it yourself. And so again, if you have any questions, feel free to comment below, or you can email me directly. I'll put my email down below as well. And please, as always, like and share the video and share it with anybody you'd like. I would really like for this to be a resource, a free resource to anybody who needs it to help whoever's out there that may need it. And thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.